Hi everyone, I am Alessia and I want to tell you about CSS Grid Layout. CSS Grid Layout is a new powerful layout system that allows our page to easily be divided into columns and rows. This CSS model defines a two-dimensional grid-based layout system, optimized for user interface design. In the grid layout model, the children of a grid container can be positioned into arbitrary slots in a predefined flexible or fit-size layout grid. In the beginning, I want to mention some interesting facts about history of grid layout. CSS Grid has been through a lot of discussions and implementation since it was first presented to W3C by Microsoft team in 2012. The difference was that in this time the Microsoft team also presented a real implementation of the grid layout. Several people started playing with it and spreading the word about it. Creators of CSS Grid Layout think that grid-based layouts have been a goal of CSS since the beginning. They remember that CSS started as something very simple. CSS has always been used to lay out web pages, but it's never done a very good job of it. First, tables were used, then floats, positioning, and line block, but all of these methods were essentially hacks and left out a lot of important functionality, for instance, vertical centering. A flexbox help out, but it's intended for simpler one-dimensional layouts, not complex two-dimensional ones. The aim of my presentation wasn't telling you about differences between grid layout and flexbox. However, I should mention that flexbox and grid actually work very well together. The syntax for CSS grid layout isn't easy to remember, but you should know it to be confident when you use CSS grid. To use CSS Grid effectively, you need to remember its properties and values. I read a really good article by Zell about an easy way to remember the most common CSS Grid properties today. This will help you to use CSS Grid without permanent Googling. CSS Grid defines according to four groups of properties: the explicit grid, gaps, aligning things, the implicit grid. Let's say you want to make a grid with 4 columns and 3 rows. If you declare the number of rows and columns in your grid, the grid is explicit. Grid template row columns lets you define the number of columns. Grid template rows lets you define the number of rows. Grid template columns create a new column for each length value you add to it. In the grid template columns declaration above, we have 4 1R values. This means 4 columns. Grid template rows work the same way. You can see the result of code on this picture. This creates a grid with 4 columns and 3 rows. You can control the position of items in a grid with two properties, grid column and grid row. These two properties can only be used on a grid item. Grid column lets you choose which columns you want to place your grid item. A shorthand for grid column start and grid column end works this way: grid column start / grid column end. You can also use the span keyword to tell CSS Grid how many columns you want your item to take up. The result of it is on this picture. Grid row lets you choose which rows you want to place your grid item. A shorthand for grid row start and grid row end works this way: grid row start / grid row end. The result of it you can see on this picture. You can name parts of your grid if you don't like counting rows and columns. These named parts are called grid areas. To create a grid area, you should use grid template areas on the grid. And also you should know some notes on creating grid areas. The first, you must name every grid area. The second, if you don't want to name an area, use dot. The third, each group separated by inverted quotes signifies a row. The fourth, each value within inverted quotes signifies an area. The example here has 3 grid areas. Header on the first row and takes up 4 columns. Main on the second row and takes up the middle 2 columns. Footer on the third row and takes up 4 columns. To place items in a grid area, you use the grid area property on the grid item. To place items on a grid area, you use grid area. You can see the result of it on this picture. When you create a grid, you can create spaces between columns and rows. These spaces are called gaps. Grid column gap determines the space between columns. Grid row gap determines the space between rows. Grid gap is a shorthand for grid column gap and grid row gap. The result of it you can see on this picture. Aligning things. This is where many people get confused. There are 6 properties to align things. Justify content and align content. Justify items and align items. Justify self and align self. You can see 2 groups of patterns here. The first group is justify versus align. The second group is content, items, and self. Justify versus align. Each CSS grid has 2 axes, the inline axis, the block axis. When you justify something, you are changing the alignment according to the inline axis. When you align something, you are changing the alignment according to the block axis. Inline axis reads left to right. Block axis reads top to bottom. You can see that on this picture. Inline left to right, block top to bottom. Content, item, and self. Justify content and align content lets you align the grid itself to the available space outside of the grid. You will only need these properties if your grid is smaller than its defined area, which is rare. You can pick from 7 values. Start, flash grid to the start of the axis. End, flash grid to the end of the axis. Center, align grid to the center of the axis. Stretch, grid fills the axis. This is the default value. Space between, spreads white space between grid items, no white space at the ends. Space around, spreads white space around each grid item. Space evenly, spreads white space evenly around all grid items, including the ends. Justify items and align items lets you align grid items to any available white space in their respective cells. You can pick from the same 4 values. Start, flash item to the start of the axis. End, flashed item to the end of the axis. Center, align item to the center of the axis. Stretch, fill the axis. This is the default value. Justify self and align self and does the same thing as justify items and align items. The difference is it lets you change the alignment for only one grid item. Implicit grid. Let's say you created a CSS grid, but you don't have enough rows. In this example, an explicit grid was created for 3 items. But we have 6 items. When you don't have enough space in your explicit grid, CSS Grid will help you create additional grids automatically. By default, it will create more rows. You can adjust the automatically created columns or rows with these 2 properties, grid outer columns, grid outer rows. You can see the result of it on this picture. So, if you still have that question why CSS Grid, here are a few points I would like to list it for you. The first, cleaner markups. The second, increase of maintainability and flexibility for layout. The third, easy to achieve more complicated layouts as you can work with columns and rows simultaneously. The fourth, the current support is at 88.3% of the global website traffic, so definitely okay. In my view, I do think CSS Grid Layout is the best way to create a layout for a web page, especially if you combine it with Flexbox. So I suppose you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you for your attention.